colleague Tim Bibby is a co-director and a professor in religious studies, and we really appreciate you coming tonight. Tim's students see him after class on a quiz on the event. So I'm especially grateful that you came knowing that there's a presidential debate, the first one tonight. And I was rather bored by this fact. The presidential campaign set its first debate before the state because we chose this day long beforehand. So I shot off an email to the White House. About a month ago, I knew Professor Obama in grad school. While he was at Harvard Law School, I was at Harvard University School with my PhD. And I met him playing intramural basketball. He played for the Harvard Law School Sharks, and I played for the Harvard University School Zealots. And like most intramural sports, the best thing about it is having gear together after. They're really miserable, untalented players. So I sent this email, not expecting any response, but this is what I got last week. Steve, long time no see. Sorry for your preempting your event. Say hi to everyone at Cal State. Tell them to vote. Your brother in basketball here. So tonight we have three excellent speakers and leaders of the community and the university. Mark Martinez is professor of political science at Cal State and the author of Myths of the Free Market, the Role of the State in the Capitalist Economy. The movie will be coming out. It's going to Brad Pitt in about a year. Imad Mirza is president of the Islamic Shura Council of Bakersfield. And Pastor Chad Vegas is the founding pastor of Sovereign Grace Church in Bakersfield. And is a member of the board of the Missouri High School District for third term going on, which you're expect support. So I also want to thank a couple of students and organizations without which we could not carry out this event. Joka Al-Shayed, president of the Muslim Student Association, has been a great supporter, provider of snacks, free refreshments, and doing a lot of publicity for us. Veronica Wilson, president of the Interfaith Student Alliance, also provides tremendous support for us. Now, the reason our institute needs tremendous support might be of interest to you, and that is we need money. We need help to put on these events. So if anyone is interested in talking to Tim or I afterwards about helping us out, that would be great. We'd also welcome your suggestions for events and speakers you'd like to see. So, the format for tonight, I've asked each of our panelists to prepare maybe 5 minutes of remarks, after which we have a number of questions. If you are interested in asking a question, there will be blank index cards going around. Joko will distribute them.
Raise your hand and I'll...
Raise your hand, we'll ask them, and then after about an hour, we're planning to open it up to the floor. Now, we ask that when you open up your question, when you come with a question, no speechifying, no testifying, no campaigning, no multi-part questions. So we'd appreciate that greatly. I'm sure a lot of people will want to ask questions, so we want to give everyone an opportunity. Okay, Mark, you want to start, or who wants to begin?
Yes, first. That's fine. By the way, those of you in the back, they just put out some seats over here, so if you want to grab some, so you're aware. Here's what I want to do. I want to start by giving a brief outline of my approach to these kinds of questions you're going to be asking tonight. And I prepared the remarks in written form so that I stay in the time limit, because I'm known to, when I go ad hoc, to go longer than I should. So so I put them in here. Let me say this about my brief outline regarding what we're dealing with tonight. My overview is exceedingly brief. It's not well nuanced, and it doesn't cover all the bases that could be covered, but I hope it provides you the basic understanding of my approach. If you want more information about the approach I take, look up Abraham Kuyper, K-U-Y-P-E-R. You can go to the Princeton lectures he gave that are called the Calvin Lectures at Princeton Seminary College University, and you can learn more about it. Let me say this. First, I'm a follower of Jesus Christ. This means I believe there's one God, eternally existing in three persons, Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, who created all things, including all of mankind. Further, I believe that all mankind fell into sin and rebellion against him and thus incurred his righteous judgments. I believe that because of his great love for us, he sent his Son, Jesus, to live the perfect, sinless life that we failed to pay for our sins on the cross, and to raise from the dead, conquering sin and death, and to ascend to the right hand of the Father, where he rules and reigns forever, and from where he sent the Holy Spirit, so that anyone who looks to Jesus in faith is forgiven for their sin, declared righteous in Christ, becomes a new creation, and is adopted as a child of God. This also means that Jesus is my life, that his word, which I find in the Old and New Testament, is the final arbiter of all truth and my authority in life, and that my ultimate citizenship is in heaven. Further, it means that I believe this truth is more than just a privately held belief or one path among many to God. It means that I believe it is objectively true, that there is no salvation apart from Jesus, and that all people are commanded to come to him. Second, I'm a Christian pastor and minister of the gospel. This means I'm a student and teacher of the Bible. I am someone whose life is given to making Jesus known, and I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to all who believe. Third, I am also a citizen of these United States, with all the rights and responsibilities that being a citizen entail. This means that I must always seek to be both a faithful citizen of the kingdom of God's Son and a faithful citizen of the United States. The question is, how do I accomplish both of those ends? How do I vote? How do I participate as a citizen in two kingdoms? So here's the first point I want to make. I believe that Jesus is over all. Thus I believe that there is not one square inch of the world of which he does not say, mine. Everything is his, and everything should submit to his authority. Second, I believe Jesus has decreed three spheres of authority in this age through which he governs the world. First sphere of authority is the church, which has ministerial authority. It is the church's job to preach the gospel, minister the word of God, etc. The second sphere of authority is the family, which has a parental authority. It is the family's job to raise children, nurture children, and train children in the truth. The third sphere of authority is the state, which has magisterial authority. It is the state's job to bear the sword for the purpose of restraining evil and promoting the good in civil society. Thus, while I believe Jesus is king of all, I do not believe the church has authority over the state. I believe the church should speak prophetically to the state, reminding the state that it is unwise to pass laws that violate God's laws. I believe Christians should serve in civil government and should vote as those who are called to love their neighbors well. But I do not believe the church should attempt to rule in civil government. I do not believe that is her sphere of authority. Further, I do not believe the state should attempt to rule in the church or take on a ministerial rule. I do not believe that's its sphere of authority. So with that paradigm in mind, how do I deal with the political questions of the day? One, I ask whether the government is attempting to do something that belongs to the sphere of authority of the church or the family. For example, I don't believe it's the government's job to teach my children the Bible. I believe that's the job of the family and the church. Thus, I would oppose any law that attempted to remove that authority from the family or the church. Second, I ask whether the government is attempting to do something in accord with God's law, or whether it's attempting to do something out of accord with God's law. For example, if the government passes a law that requires the killing of innocent human beings, like abortion. then I believe it's my job to vote against, speak against, and work against such policies. Thirdly, if neither of the two just mentioned apply, then I'm left with my last test, which is this. I ask whether the government is doing something that I consider wise and in line with the Constitution. For example, I don't see it as wise to pass laws that restrict freedom of speech or the free exercise of religion. Further, I think such laws would contradict the Constitution. Thus, I would vote against, speak against, and work against such laws. Now, let me conclude with this. I don't claim to do all this without error. I am constantly learning, and I'm constantly having to course correct as I go along the road. So I am thankful for the opportunity to be here, and I trust that I'll learn from and be challenged by these other men. Thanks.
All right, I'm glad to see such a great audience here. I think the fact that we have a presidential election, this is a great testament to democracy, what we have in this country. Given that there's a lot of important issues that are going to be discussed tonight, the fact that you're here to listen to three, if I can say, mediocre representatives of the community, this says a lot about your interest, especially the topic and the issues that confront democracy, and that's going to confront democracy in the next 100 years, 200 years, or however long we're here. With that, let me start off with a couple of things. I think there's much that I can agree with Chad about, and we'll probably discuss some of that. There's a number of things, however, I think that we want to keep in mind when we look at the type of democracy and the type of nation we have. We're going to discuss the role of religion in the presidential debates and presidential elections. One of the things I just want to make sure that I can get in the first 5 minutes is that when I discuss religion and politics in our class, we talk about First Amendment and First Amendment rights. One of the things I try to make clear is that when we look at this country and what it was founded upon, we are often told that we were founded as a Christian fortress or as a Christian nation. That's simply not the case. And we can talk about the Founding Fathers and what they had to say, but I think when we look at the evidence from a constitutional, legal, and historical perspective, it's pretty simple. Think about what the Constitutional Convention, what emerged out of the Constitutional Convention. We were trying to get all of the colonies and the future states to ratify the Constitution. We know that the Constitution makes no reference to any particular religion, but we also know that in order to convince the colonies to ratify the Constitution, there was no mention or reference in the major arguments of the day to Christianity or Islam or Hinduism or any particular religion. And as a teacher and student of American politics, I always refer students or anybody who's interested when we try to understand what our Constitution was all about and what the founders and the framers intended for this country. I always tell them where you want to go is to the Federalist Papers. Real simple. Why the Federalist Papers? Because the Federalist Papers were a series of articles, or what we might call op-ed pieces, that were written during the day to convince, but in particular the state of New York, to ratify the Constitution. And so when we look at what the Federalist Papers had to say, and there's over 80 of them, every single one of them made reference to the human condition and the fallacies and the weaknesses that Pastor Vega makes reference to, but it doesn't make reference to any particular religion. What it does say is that, guess what? If men were angels, no laws would be necessary. But we're not angels. We're not necessarily good people. We have the capacity to do good, but we also have the capacity to do evil. And if you read through the Federalist Papers, what becomes clear is that there is no reference to any particular religion. And the arguments that are used to help convince the state of New York to ratify the Constitution are all secular, and there is no basis to religious or these moral principles that we like to have in our life today. But at the end of the day, when we look at the Federalist Papers, it's very clear it's very clear that the rationale for the Constitution is tied to some of the problems that we've had historically as part of the human condition, whether we're looking at the periods of the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Dark Ages, the Enlightenment. And so when we look at the Constitution and the principles that helped to found this nation, we want to start by looking at the Federalist Papers to help us understand what was it that the Founding Fathers intended and what the framers intended for this country. There's a lot more to the discussion, but I think I'll leave it at that because I'm sure some of you can have some real good questions.
In the name of God, who is gracious and most merciful, all praise due to God and peace be upon His mercy. I can see why they sat me between you two. I think they wanted to make sure that we don't lose. You know, Martin can give us mediocre praise. Mediocre is too high for me, my friend. My name is Ahmad Mirza. I'm the Emir of the Muslim community, the elected Emir, the President of the Shura Council. It's a job that I'm very humbly honored to have. I was strong-armed into it, honestly, by some of my friends that are sitting in this room. Still being strong-armed to stick with the job, I don't feel fit for it. But I take it very seriously. I take my role as a religious leader, as a Muslim. My faith is Islam. I am a Muslim. Our God is Allah. It's the God of Abraham, the God of Moses and Jesus, and the God of Muhammad and all the prophets and messengers. Our faith is a monotheistic faith, strictly. No worries. Our faith is based on the Hanafi faith that is in the tradition of Abraham, our father, the father of all these religions that came out of the Middle East, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. We very strongly believe in our faith. We believe in God's law, which we derive from the Quran, and the Sunnah, which is the ways and the practices of the Prophet Muhammad. Our first example of how to live our lives in Islam is beyond the Quran would be the Prophet himself, the Prophet Muhammad himself. And then it would be the messengers that came before him, like Jesus and Moses, peace be upon them all, and the others, and the prophets themselves. Islam says there are 300 messengers and over 124,000 prophets, and more 25 messengers were known by name. We look to them as our guides, as how we should live our lives and deal with matters of society, with the morality and virtue and ethics and politics and everything else that comes in human life. So that would be our first example of how to live our lives. Afterwards, we have the companions of the Prophet, the direct like disciples, his companions, whom he taught firsthand and who lived around him and saw him and dealt with him firsthand and dealt with the Quran and understood it the way that he intended for them to understand it, or how God taught him the Prophet through the angel Gabriel. This is important for us because we get accused of that we take Islam above all else, or we take 7th century Islam above all else, or we take the Prophet's examples and the examples of his companions above all else. That's true. We do take Islam. I heard my friend Chad talking, and I could see very clearly that his faith in God and his faith in the Bible and his decrees is first and foremost above all things. We do. We look back to their examples, and we look back to the way they lived their lives and understand the circumstances in which they dealt with things. That would be the first 3 generations besides the Prophet himself. That is what we do in our faith as Muslims. Now, we're going to be talking a lot about separation of church and state, things to that effect. As you know, in the classical sense in Islamic law, it's very akin to what you find in the Torah with Moses, peace be upon him. The state was dictated and run by, in a theocratic sense, and God's law, which would be either from the Torah or from the Quran in our case, would run society. Society would be government, every facet of society would be run by what we would call the Sharia. Now, that has ceased to exist in the world. There is no Islamic state in the world today. Iran is not an Islamic state in the classical sense whatsoever. It's a minority sect, and Saudi Arabia is a kingdom. It is not an Islamic state like some people like to think. We do not have an Islamic state. The only theocracy in the world today is the Vatican. It's a Christian place. but it's really the only true theocracy that resides or still remains in the world today. So as Muslims, we live all over the world, and we live in our own countries, in the Middle East, and across the Islamic world, which is not confined just to the Middle East. The Middle East, by the way, is about 55 Muslim nations in the world. Islamic law isn't really what governs our lives. We have to try to figure out a way to implement our faith and the teachings of our faith in the societies that we live in. In the West, of course, mostly it's secular democracies that we live in, or like here in the United States. And we do find ways to do that, and there are ways to do that, and it is incumbent upon Muslims that wherever they do reside, wherever they do live, whatever contract they do enter into, in whichever state that they're at, whichever government that is in charge and authority over them, that once they enter that treaty, that agreement to live in that state, they need to honor that law, and they need to live within its confines. And they need to practice their faith in a manner in which that one, they are able to give to God what God desires and needs from them, and two, that they do not break the laws of the state that they reside in. If the laws in the state in which they reside in become so oppressive and so unjust to them, so that they cannot exercise their free right to worship and practice their lives as Muslims, and they are actually informed to migrate away. Obviously, it's an oppressive place, an oppressive land. You migrate, you don't turn and fight. Okay, so that, and I'm sure you guys want to ask me some questions in regards to that. In regards to Muslims here in the United States now, in modern times, and what we're dealing with here currently, we feel like we may not have the privileges that the other people around us, our neighbors, our fellow citizens are having. Just freely thinking about all that's going on, and thinking about the parties, and thinking about the candidates, and thinking about all the different elements of our society, because we're constantly under attack about our faith. We're constantly under attack about all these matters that pertain to our faith, whether they're 7th century matters that are true, or whether they're a bunch of fabrications that are simply not true, that are exaggerated and used against us to make Islam seem evil, to make Muslims seem evil, inherently evil, to make Islam seem inherently evil, and Muslims seem inherently evil. This is something that we're also living with. Now, I'm not saying this is the majority of Americans, or this is going on everywhere, but there is a large enough movement in the United States that it concerns Muslims. It's something they deal with day in, day out. They hear it on the news, they hear it on radio, they have people in government talking about it. They just seem to deal with it on a daily basis. And so some Muslims really deal with that issue a lot more than they are dealing with some of the issues that you people are dealing with, which is just who's best for the job, what parties are, what issues of the day are most relevant for us. But in a nutshell, I'm probably going too long. For us, morality and virtue is very important. Moral codes and the things that you'll find that are taught in the Bible, the Jewish Bible, the Christian Bible, you'll find in the Quran the same. We like to see society tend to that moral and virtuous way of life, and so we tend to support more of those issues than not. One of the basic, fundamental rules in Islam is this: we are supposed to command that which is right, and we are supposed to forbid that which is wrong. Okay, but in doing so, we are supposed to have knowledge, correct knowledge about it. And then we're supposed to have compassion, adequate compassion of the matter. And then we're supposed to have patience, adequate patience in the matter. But finally, even with all those things lined up, you do not command the right or forbid the wrong if it brings about more harm to society, if that makes sense to you. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn to our questions, and hopefully we'll get into more of this as we go along. Thank you very much.
For about half an hour, we've got questions that I've gathered from my students and colleagues. But if you'd like to submit a question in writing to me, Joka has index cards. Please fill one question out. If you'd like to do so around 6:30 or so, we'll open up the floor to questions.
Also, if you guys have your note cards ready, just hold them up and I'll come pick them up.
Now, for the panelists, these questions you can pass to your neighbor. You can You can all answer it. You can rebut one another. Basically, you can do whatever you want except send the question back to me. I can't answer. The first question I received was the following. Should there be a religious litmus test for presidential candidates? How important is a candidate's religious faith and moral character? Any volunteers to go first?
Yeah, I'll make this real simple. No, there shouldn't be, but there is. And I think a person's moral character does make a difference. I think spirituality makes a difference. I'm not particularly sure that their religion makes a difference. But I think knowing that somebody looks at this world and elsewhere beyond tells us all that these are people who think beyond what we're doing here today. And so the religious litmus test, absolutely not. This is one of the reasons why we have what we have in the Constitution, Article 6, etc. But I guess I think understanding a little bit about someone's spirituality is important. The religion, in particular religion, I don't think is important for holding office.
You know, honestly, all due respect, Mark, I disagree. And in this case, in Islam, we're taught that the private sin should be between a person and God, okay? And it should not be publicized by other people. People should not go about trying to drag out people's private sins, whatever those private sins may be, okay? But the public sin is something that does damage to society, it does degrade society. And so if an individual is engaged in what we would consider public sin, whether it be moral behavior in terms of sexuality or moral behavior in terms of drugs or alcohol or any type of crime that we understand, is not good. That should have an effect on, it should have some sort of variant on whether this person is righteous or wrong. I'd like to add this. The way we understand Islam, and this is another place where we're conflicted. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, taught us that when you seek to give someone these types of positions of leadership, you give it to the one who doesn't want it, who's most qualified for it, but actually doesn't want it, okay? And then you do not give it to the one who's asking for it, okay? So obviously, as you know, in these type of situations that we're in now, in democracy, the way we go to people, it's difficult for us. You have to really hope that the person is doing this for all the right reasons, that he really just wants to go into office to do something good for the community and to go back to the life that he used to live. He really just wants to serve this time. And so for Muslims, that is a conflict. But in terms of how important is a candidate's religious faith and moral character, I think the religious faith, we understand, this is like a diverse country, the founders of this nation, and I know that I'm probably not going to have any argument up here, honestly. For example, George Washington was a theist and was most likely not a Trinitarian Christian, but he was a man of God, he believed in God, okay? And so I think anyone who, let me say this to me on this last part, again, we are a multi-dimensional society when it comes to faith, and it includes people without faith. But for those people that are atheists who don't believe in God, you have to remember this. The majority of the world, not just the United States of America, the majority of the world believes in God, some sort of God. More than 95% of the world, I believe, believes in God, and the majority of this nation believes in God. So it would be very difficult for someone, for example, to have a belief that is antithetical to the vast majority of the people that they represent, and have that person be a leader. Not that that person should be harassed, harmed in any way, etc., but it would be difficult for the rest of the majority to be able to take that person as their leader. I would presume. Okay, I'll stop there.
Well, I'll agree with you both of it. Here's the thing. As respects Article 6 of the Constitution regarding religious litmus test, there isn't supposed to be a religious litmus test by the government as to whether you hold office. However, it says nothing about how individuals vote. And so as individual voters, I suppose we can apply any religious litmus test we want to apply, or any other litmus test we want to apply to who we vote for. In fact, we all do that. We're going to choose a presidential candidate based on a series of litmus tests we may have set up, and some of those may be religious. and that's fine. With regard to how important is their faith and character, I think it's very important. In fact, I wish our presidential candidates would talk about it more. Why do I say that? Because I would prefer to know a guy's religious agenda up front rather than have it brought in the back door after he's already elected. I'd like to just know what the guy believes on all matters that I can know and be appraised of that so I can make a educated choice as to whether or not he's a candidate that I want to support. Christians, at least evangelical ones, fundamentally believe that a person's religion shapes their worldview, how they approach all other questions. And so we would want to know that. Now that doesn't mean that we only elect other Christians, but we definitely want to know what their worldview is. With regard to the question of George Washington, since you nodded my way. And this whole question of a Christian nation, as Dr. Martinez referenced earlier, just let me make a brief statement about that. If by Christian nation, or if by Christian with regard to George Washington, we mean, did George Washington belong to what we would see as a typical Protestant Christian denomination, then the answer is yes, and so did most of the founders, incidentally. If by Christian nation we mean, did George Washington embrace Trinitarianism? Did he embrace what we would see as the Nicene Creed? And the tenets of the Protestant Reformation, like Scripture alone, faith alone, grace alone, Christ alone, etc. Then the answer would be no, he didn't. He was a theistic rationalist. In fact, they attempted, some of his pastors and friends attempted to trap him into more than once confessing Christ as Lord and Savior, and refused to do it. But George Washington was a theistic rationalist, and was Christian in the sense that Obama's a Christian, if you will, in the sense that he basically said, I'm a Christian. But he was not a Christian by the evangelical definition of the term.
And I don't disagree with that. I just want to add one more thing. The way this question is asked, I'm not stating that there should be some sort of law or that there must be. What I'm saying is that we would say to our communities, we would expect that there would be some sort of litmus test of morality and virtue and faith on children.
Well, maybe I'll take it another direction. Maybe we can ask. How many people here would vote for somebody who was an atheist? It's pretty good. Okay, I just wanted to throw that out.
Okay, well, I'm getting a lot of questions from the audience, and I'm going to take those in order, but we have a few other questions we prepared ahead of time. One is, please discuss the issue of gay marriage and gay rights in relation to the faith perspectives of Romney and Obama.
I didn't last one first, but I'll take this one first as well. I think both of these, neither one of them want to talk about it. Well, not just the president, you guys either. It's obviously one of those topics that the Flames make passionate. But if you look at the position of both President Obama and Romney, they're pretty much following the party line. Although President Obama in the last 6 to 9 months has been much more of an advocate and promoting gay rights and marriage, I think if we're looking at how this plays out in the campaign, at this point I don't think it's making that big of a difference because most people have already drawn their lines in the sand. But as far as do they want to talk about it, I don't think so.
Great.
With regard to the topic of gay marriage, I think it's an oxymoron, so it's tough for me to even answer the question. Just the term doesn't really exist in reality. But with regard to faith perspectives with Romney and Obama, clearly one of them has said that they think gay marriage is wrong, and the other one has said they think it's good. We'll see. I don't have any polling data to say whether or not the nation is with one of them or the other. Clearly, in the states where the issues come up, thus far, every state in which it's ever been, where that issue's come up, the citizens of the state have voted in favor of traditional marriage. But I'm not sure what will happen in the states that are coming up in November, because there's some coming up in November which may turn that tide, actually. There's a couple that looks like the poll numbers look like they may go in favor of changing the definition of marriage. And so we'll see.
Yeah, I think if we were going to look at the trends, I think gay marriage is absolutely probably most likely going to be acceptable in most of the United States in our lifetime, in the years to come. I think if we're looking at it from a strictly constitutional perspective, and I'm not a constitutional lawyer or anything like that, but the federal guidelines, it seems, there's really no mention, there's nothing that prohibits it. But I think that if we were going to try to impose it federally on the states, then we would have a problem. I think it's a state issue. It seems to me that it would be a state issue more than a federal issue. But in terms of, again, we've got to go back to, morality, we've got to go back to virtue, we've got to go back to faith and things to that effect. And we cannot not state what we believe about our faith. And we, as Muslims, identify this nation primarily as a Christian nation. We do. But we also understand that the founders were very open to Jews, very clearly. George Washington made it very explicit to them in writing and in person, to Muslims, to Hindus, to Buddhists, to others, to be a part of this nation and to bring in their values, to bring in their morality, to bring in their faith and practice it freely. That's just simply a fact of life. But it doesn't mean that this nation wasn't founded in some way, or morally speaking, on biblical values. I believe that it was, and I believe that it also looked at the Quran in a positive light. With that said, the majority, it is the majority, believes that it should be done. I also don't believe, I believe there's tyranny can go two ways. I believe that the majority can be tyrannical towards the minority, without a doubt. That's why this Constitution was set up, so that the majority wouldn't be tyrannical towards the minority, specifically in matters of faith. But I also believe there are times when a minority can impose its will on a majority, and it can actually be oppressive to some degree. That doesn't mean that if the tide changes and the majority allows it, then so be it, then it's acceptable and it's fine. But I think when we're going to try to mandate it through courts and mandate it through presidents and things to that effect and try to force it down the throats of the majority, then I think it's wrong. God knows.
Okay, ready for the next question? In the New Testament, Christian New Testament, the Hebrew Bible, and the Quran, there's a tremendous concern for social justice. Jesus mentions poverty perhaps more than any other issue. How are these values reflected in the platforms of each candidate as regards the economy, the notion of government, and the idea of a social welfare system? Why do both of these Christians have radically different views on the importance of the social safety net that supports the poor, the marginalized, and those in need of medical aid?
One of the other things I kind of want to mention is, for me personally, as an American and somebody looking at the political landscape, looking at the parties and things that are going on, I simply don't like it. I don't like the parties, the way that they're polarizing the nation. The issues have become so far right and so far left in a lot of ways. The nation is becoming divided. It's clear by the way these elections are, and hardly a president can win 50% of the vote. And ironically, I'll bring up his name again, George Washington, the first president elected to the United States, in a way that we Muslims look at it and say, wow, that's very honorable, because the vast majority of the best people around him wanted him to be him. And so it was almost like he was nominated and accepted by all of them, and the election was kind of just one of these things that didn't just take place. He almost could have been a king, but there were no parties at the time. People don't realize that there were no parties. And ironically, it wasn't just that there were no parties, but this individual, George Washington, on his way out, warned against parties. He saw them coming, and he warned against them because he felt the evils that would create and the division that would cause in our nation. I don't believe either of these two men really, truly don't want to help the poor. I believe Mitt Romney has done a very poor job of showing that, and I believe that many conservatives have taken on an ideology that and it's funny, because many conservatives really identify themselves as evangelical Christians, and quite frankly, Jesus was an amazing advocate for the poor in the downtrodden. I mean, we cannot avoid that. Peace be upon him. He's one of my biggest heroes. And he wasn't looking out for the kings and emperors and rulers and rich. I mean, he even said that a rich man is hard from enter paradise and it is for a camel and God needle. There was a reason for him to say that. But I do believe that it's the landscape of politics today. It pushes these people so far away from the center, from something that is morally good. Helping the poor is morally good. People are going to be downtrodden. People are not going to have their breaks. People are going to fall into these bad places in life. Conversely, people are going to take advantage of the system. People are going to be lazy. People are not going to work. And that exists too. We can't avoid the fact that does exist. So I think in some cases, one candidate may want to say, look, we want to help the poor. We want to help them help themselves. That is a good word. That's a good thing. Okay? And the other candidate saying, look, some of them, it's very difficult. We just need to be sure that we don't let them have a life that could be bad. They don't have food. They don't have basic necessities. And that's good too. So I think the real problem we have is what I mentioned, where the parties are polarizing the nation, they're polarizing the platforms, and neither man can look good to either side, and that's sad. Because enemies can respect themselves. How about patriots of the same nation? And I know that Washington and the founders of this nation, I can't imagine that they looked at each other the way that these people nowadays, these politicians look at each other and talk about each other. It's a shame, unfortunately.
Actually, some of the things that were said against Jefferson were rather tame compared to some of the things you see today. But
the problem with the question is, for me, is that I reject the premise of the question on a couple of counts. One, while Jesus certainly speaks of poverty and deals with that quite extensively, it isn't mentioned more than any other issue in the New Testament. It's just a false assertion. The second issue is the assertion that both Obama and Romney are Christians. I would reject actually that assertion as well on a number of grounds. But why do both of these men have different views on these issues with regard to social safety nets? I really can't speak on behalf of Romney or Obama. Romney's comments to me on social safety nets and capitalism seem more akin to the arguments of Ayn Rand for capitalism in his recent comments than they do akin to typical moral arguments for capitalism, and that concerns me, the philosophy from which Romney is arguing for that. But the bottom line is they have different views of the role of government. That's the bottom line, different views of the role of government. It's not an issue of whether or not they both care about the poor. I imagine they both care about the poor. In fact, I think Romney gave some 30 to 40% of his income to charity last year. Joe Biden, was in excess of $4 million. And Joe Biden, the vice president, who says he cares about the poor, gave like $3,000 to charity last year. It's less than I give to charity. I don't make nearly as much money as he does. And so my guess is that to make the argument that these men don't care about, one cares about the poor, the other doesn't, because of their different views of the role of government, is I think, the wrong question. I think the question is, what is the proper role of government? And who's right about the proper role of government? Not who cares about the poor. I'm not sure which of these men care about the poor more, to be honest with you. I have no idea how much of it's politicking and how much of it's sincerity. I don't know. What I know is they're positing different views of the role of government, and which role of government is more appropriate with regard to the poor is the question.
When I looked at that question, there were a couple of things popped out. I kind of, like Chad, I kind of rejected the premise or the principle. But, when I think about poverty, one of the things that we focus on in this society, most people like to focus on people who are out of work and who are not working. And there's this caricature of people who are lazy, people who are dependents, and get into that 47% thing, but I'll leave that alone. But many people have this caricature of people who are in poverty that simply doesn't do justice to the issue. You can look at the Bible, you can read the Bible, you can look at the Quran, and the number of ways we can define why people end up in poverty. We never really have this discussion. The Bible is very clear about people who fall into bad luck, famine, cancer, etc. And why is it that what happens to people who end up and circumstances beyond their own control. You talk about people who, because of false judgment, just think about the number of people recently who lost their home after 2008. A lot of people like to say and argue that maybe they bought a house that was too big. Well, no, that's not necessarily the case. I can give you example after example of people who lost their homes because of fraud. And if you think about the number of people who lost their jobs after 2008, not because they didn't do a good job, not because they didn't work hard, but because they were victims of an economy that collapsed because of events on Wall Street. And so if you start thinking about poverty, the causes of poverty, what we tend to do is look at, I think, a caricature of poverty, and we tend to look at, or ignore other aspects that are very clear in the Bible and other places when we want to try to understand the causes for poverty. And these are the issues that we're talking about, the role of government. We're talking about the role of government. Government needs to look at all aspects, not just providing the safety net, but making sure that the conditions that lead people to losing their jobs or get kicked out of their houses or something like that. These are the issues that need to be looked at, and not just the issue of social safety nets. We can debate social safety nets all day long, but when we talk about the role of government is also there, and this is spelled out in the Bible, and we look at Romans. The role of the government is also not just to protect, but it's also provide for the public good. And that part of the public good means having a system of justice that works correctly, a system of justice that's applied correctly, and there's a number of other aspects here, but I've already probably run over time.
Do you want to move on to the next question, or do you want us to interact on that at all?
Well, feel free to
Go ahead, please.
You know, each one of these questions, it would be difficult for us to elaborate on every facet of the question. And then, you know, like Chad was saying, it's not necessarily all these questions are exactly correct. I may feel the same way. I do believe, though, that Jesus in his life, in the life that he chose to live, like John the Baptist's life, he chose to live, you know, many of the teachings of the statements definitely point towards, you know, the downtrodden, those of the unfortunates, et cetera, et cetera. I also agree with Martin that there are events that do take place that create bad and unfortunate situations for people of all different, you know, socioeconomic backgrounds that can happen. And then there are people who just happen to be, you know, just live in normal places. I mean, they live in very difficult places to really make it in this country. And they do need help. They need assistance. Muslims, we are social conservatives, and it comes to morality, virtue, things that effect. Okay, but when it comes to helping others, to people in poverty, things that effect, we do believe that there's a place for the state to make sure that people are fed, people do have basic necessities, are able to be buried, are able to go to hospitals, get medical care, things that effect. I mean, it's something that you know, we do believe in. At the same time, we believe in a free market economy. We believe in people need to go out and work, and the markets need to be open, and people need to be able to build businesses, things that effect. So, again, we believe there's a balance. There's a balance in these things. And I do believe, whether it's biblical, whether it's Quranic, or whether it's just moral and moral code of society, especially in our nation, we don't want to see those less fortunate, you know, stay out of the group. So not only do we want to help them, we also want to make ways for them to help themselves. And I think that churches do a lot of good work, synagogues do good work in their communities, mosques try to do good work in their communities, other temples and whatnot. So religious organizations do good work, but it's impossible to imagine that they could really reach out to everybody. And I think the government has to come in and fill in the areas that they don't encompass.
Let me say one other quick thing on the poverty issue biblically. It's clear that in the Bible that God's people care about the poor. Abundantly clear. You go to the Old Testament, you can look at examples. For example, if you owned land, and whenever you owned land, you had to leave the exterior of the land available to be gleaned by the poor, so that if the poor needed food, they could go to your land, they could take some of the crop on the exterior of the land, and they could be fed. If you go to something like a man loses his land because of poverty, falls on hard times, he has to sell his land or lose his land. On the Sabbath year, and on the 50th year, the year of Jubilee, that land is to be returned to him, so he's made whole again. So there are clear concerns about poverty. If you come into the New Testament, Jesus clearly cares about the poor, clearly. And throughout, James chapter 2, for example, we're told not to treat the poor any differently than we treat the rich. If the rich are being treated better than the poor, that's a problem with us. And so we're told those things multiple times. The objection that Christian conservatives have to an overbearing amount of government interference into helping the poor is not the objection that it's wrong to ever provide any kind of social safety net for those who are clearly downtrodden or on hard times. It's the objection to something like is dealt with in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, which is if you don't work, you don't eat. And Paul's point in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 isn't if you don't work because you can't work, you don't eat. His point is if you don't work because you won't work, you don't eat. And so when we set up systems that encourage people not to work, that's where somebody like me objects. So if I look at something like the Great Society, multiple billions of dollars later, and I look at the inner cities that are supposed to help, those inner cities now have gone from 80 to 90% families that are married, that are intact, and working people, to 80 to 90% families that are no longer intact, that are ripped apart, that have high rates of crime and poverty, and we've made little to no progress in actually turning around the problem because of the way the government's approached it. And that's my concern. Not that the government never approached it, but that the government approach it in a way that we help those who can't work, not help those who won't work. Those are the big distinctions.
Well, let me add here that my concern really isn't with the number of people who are poor and are dependent, and there are a group of people, in spite of the caricature that we know won't work. I think every single one of us has tried to help people and done our best efforts and spent years and money and the rest of that stuff. And they simply they're just not going anywhere. These aren't my concerns. These are people that, unfortunately, we've had these people throughout human history. What my concern is when we talk about the role of government and safety nets, and again, we can talk about the levels of safety nets. My concern is what's been happening with governments and over the past 20, 30, 40, 50 years. If you talk about how we are going to create a society where everyone has access and freedom and liberty and opportunities, what we see over the past 20, 30 years is a good deal of favorable legislation, significant bailouts. As a matter of fact, if you look at the number of bailouts over the past 20 and 30 years, we have become, as Barry Ritholtz terms it, a bailout nation. And it's not for the poor. And if you look at just this bailout in 2008, it varies completely the amount of money we spend on social safety nets. Think about this. We have already spent $4 trillion on Wall Street. We are on the hook for another 8 to 10 and perhaps $12 trillion. Why is this significant? Think about our national budget. We hear a lot about the national debt. The national debt is about $16 trillion today. You can place it, blame wherever you want to place it. But right now, we are on the hook for between $8 to $12 trillion due directly to the events that happened on Wall Street because they got favorable treatment, they got favorable legislation. And so when you think about the people who are poor, the legitimate people that aren't going to do anything to help themselves, what we pay out for these people is a drop in the bucket compared to the $4 trillion we've already spent on Wall Street and the other $8 to $12 trillion we're on the hook for. So I'm not so much concerned about the safety net for the caricature or even the individual who's not going to do anything for themselves. My concern is what we've been doing lately to benefit a select few, especially in Wall Street and the financial industry, who actually are doing little to nothing, and as a matter of fact, even burying this country because of the legislation that they've been getting over the past 15, 20, 30 years. But
and Mark, I mean, as a person who's politically conservative, I can't say amen any more to that than that, because I don't believe in corporate welfare, corporate bailouts, or subsidies that are given to essentially welfare for rich farmers. And so I don't agree with any of it. So I mean, I'm a guy who was unhappy with Bush, unhappy with Clinton. I mean, I've been unhappy all the time with politics. So it's not like I think that we're going down the road we need to be going down.
And you know what? And I'll add it. And I'll add one other thing. You say about the bailout. But honestly, this is an area. This is maybe a little secondary. But also, you got to remember, we have an enormous defense budget, okay? And we have an enormous debt. $16 trillion is not a small amount of money. I don't know how this nation is ever going to pay its debts off. I mean, it is huge. So, well, I don't know. Maybe we can blow the economy that much, but we do have to look at all these things, and we've got to look at the wars that we're in, and the wars that we continue to propose, and the wars that we continue to see all in. These wars cost trillions of dollars that we don't have. They also kill people. They kill our people. They kill people abroad. There's collateral damage. We kill innocent people all over the world. All in these countries that we kill. But the one we just can't. I'll go back again to an individual. When I mention his name again, the rest of these you're going to go and say, God, he brought up this guy's name so many times. George Washington. Now, he's my hero in this country. I mean, he really is. I look at him and I look at his life and look at what he did. But he also told us to stay out of foreign wars. And I'm not saying that's necessarily perfectly practical in the modern centuries, but it was his advice, okay? And so, on one hand, you need more money for, the poor and the downtrodden, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, you don't want to give this money to these corporations that have been stealing it and earning it in what both the Bible and Ron said is not a good way, which is usury. But by the same token, I think we also have to look at our foreign policy and look at the military situation. That doesn't mean don't support our troops. It doesn't mean don't give them jobs. It doesn't mean don't give them care. It doesn't mean it doesn't mean forget them. That's ridiculous. They should be first and foremost. But it does mean that we have to really consider whether we should be in these types of wars. And for Muslims, it's difficult because most of these wars are Muslim countries, and the majority of people that get hurt by these wars are innocent people.
Okay, I'm going to break in here. Obviously, our panelists could enlighten us for hours. But what I want to do now is go out into the audience. We've decided to give preferential choice on questions to students. But you're all welcome. Please, no speechifying, campaigning, testifying, witnessing, or multi-purpose questions. I hope that leaves something for you. And please let us have the mic back. Okay? And we'll try to go to first come, first serve students.
Okay, we'll do the mic.
Okay, I see a philosophy student here, so you're in trouble.
I wanted to continue with the poverty question. Where do you guys see the role of education in terms of how to deal with poverty? And because, that's basically my question. Like we talked about a great society, you kind of mentioned that, and to me it seems like a lot of it is due to the inequality in education that a lot of people receive, and how can, as a Christian or a Muslim or whatever, how do you deal with the issue of education?
I'll just make it real simple, real quick. I think it's absolutely important. And the more difficult we make education, not just education, but access to higher education, we are cutting our future short.
And Muslims, for example, we believe very strongly in family unit, family responsibility of the household. And so, yes, I agree. I think there are places where, unfortunately, education is not as fair, fairly being funded, but it does still start at home. It starts with a family. I know this is hard to say because some people don't have even the privilege of having family, or they may be in situations that are more difficult than many of us. But it does start with that family unit, helping them to not only educate their children themselves or make sure that they do their homework, etc., but it deals with the schools, it deals with the teachers, and things to that effect. But education, I think, public education should be supported as much as private education and charter education. But I also think that we need to look at some of the inequality that some areas may receive better funding and better materials, better programs than other areas. I think that does happen. My wife's a school teacher. She's been a school teacher for over 20 years at Bakersfield City. And we know just by what she teaches versus some of the other places in the city. There's a disparity. It's sad to say there's a disparity.
I don't really have a whole lot to add to what they said, except that as a person who served, obviously, over the current high school district as part of the board of trustees for, I'm going into my 9th year here pretty soon, as of December. Obviously, I think education is very important, and I think education is important. I also taught in the current high school district for 5 years, and my wife is an elementary school teacher, and so we've always found education very important. And I would agree with him with regard to the fact that that it needs to start in the home. And I would say that one of our biggest educational problems is the breakdown of the family. And the family is such a mess in our society that these children come to school with zero backing, help, support. Their parents are a mess at home. They're carrying all that into school. It's pretty hard to focus when mom and dad are ripping each other apart at home, or when one's bailed out on the other. It's tough for these kids, and frankly, if we don't get the family together, I don't think we're going to see the educational situation improve a whole bunch. So.
And I think that's where, you want to build that family unit, you want to have it there, you want it to be, available to these children, but a lot of times it isn't. And a lot of times they see worse than what even Chad's describing, the abuse. Some of the things these kids see when they come to these classrooms, and my wife would say, she shows me, explains it to me, you really have to feel for these kids. So on the other hand, you come to where we're talking about, there needs to be some programs, there needs to be funding for these programs, because where else are these kids going to go if we as a society don't find a way to help them? Because at home, it doesn't happen. Even though Chad, he's a pastor, he wants to build that family unit. I'm somebody that, as an Amir, I want to see those family units built and teach those kids everything they need to have, and they have what my child has. I want that child to have what my child has. It's the Quran and Muhammad says, if you do not want for your brother what you want for yourself, then you don't have faith in your heart. And if I sleep as a Muslim, full, and my neighbor is hungry, then I'm not a person of faith. And who are your neighbors? Well, 40 houses in every direction. I think it's 40, maybe more. And so we have to have compassion for these people. We have to want for them what you want for yourself. So sometimes churches and mosques and synagogues can deliver, and temples and whatnot can deliver. And many times what we're finding out, they cannot get everybody. They cannot deliver. And so the government has to have a role. And we need to find a way to merge the insanity between these polarized politics and just get back to the morality of the situation and get it out.
You come to the next one. You have your hand up. We have someone back there. Oh, okay.
In response to Mr. Davis's statement about how poverty is just one aspect of many covered in the Bible, I just wanted to get your perspective on the scripture that states true Christianity is to care for the widows and orphans, and what role that would have in government.
Yeah, you're referring to James 1:27. It does say that it's to care for widows and orphans and keep oneself unstained from the world. I think that's what you need to do. I mean, Christians ought to do that. They ought to care for orphans and widows. That clearly isn't a statement given to the federal government of the United States. It's given to individual Christians, and I think individual Christians ought to be engaged in that. And I'll say a lot of individual Christians I know are engaged in that. I know lots of people who are adopting orphans, and I see growing, actually encouraging things I see as a pastor, as a growing movement in evangelicalism for the desire and ministry for adoption of orphans. And that is a huge, fast-growing ministry. I'm excited to see that growing because we need to be engaged in that more than we have been. One of the problems in American Christianity, like any version of any religion around the world, is that you tend to syncretize, mix together your faith with the culture that's surrounding it. And one of the problems in American Christianity is that our syncretism has been essentially that we're so interested in our own wealth and ourselves that we haven't cared for the orphans and the widows well. When I was in Uganda, I was with a pastor who, he and his wife came to a meal, and they loaded up the plate. His wife loaded up the plate. I've never seen anybody eat that much food in my life. And I asked him, I said, I've never seen a woman or a man eat that much food. And I'm a big guy, and I was overwhelmed by how much food. And I said, what's going on there? She goes, well, you're buying us, he said, you're buying us a meal. And I said, well, why is it such a huge deal? He says, well, we eat every 3 or 4 days. I said, you eat every 3 or 4 days? He said, yeah. I said, I saw 4 orphans in your home that were Sudanese refugees. I said, do they only eat every 3 or 4 days? He goes, no, they eat every day. He says, we can only afford to feed them every day, and we just go without food for every 3 or 4 days to take care of them. And I said, well, that's amazing. I'm so impressed to see you guys do that. I wish more Christians would do that. And he says, well, doesn't the Bible say take care of orphans and widows? So why don't Christians in America do that? And honestly, I sat there stunned. Thought, you're right. That's a huge problem we have, and we need to address it better.
Okay, the next question. Is it over here?
the charge is often leveled against the religious community, particularly Christians, that their public policy proposals are infused or laden with some kind of religious bias. But what is the alternative? Is there such a thing as an atheistic public policy proposal that doesn't have a religious background or root?
Mark, you want to take that question?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by atheistic. When I look at public policy, and I'm not an expert on public policy, but I think most of the, if you look at most public policy experts, they take what they think is a secular approach. I don't know if that's the same as what you're referring to, but when I look at problems that need to be solved, I look at the numbers and I look at what needs to be done, and I'm sure a number of people here will say, well, they will pray first, and even though I will admit to being a bad Catholic, sometimes I do pray as well. But when you talk about it, atheistic, I don't know if it's atheistic, but when I try to just secular approach, common sense, these numbers don't add up as a movement here. And I guess that kind of answers the question. I don't know what an atheistic is.
I think probably what he's getting at is the idea that there is such a thing as a public policy position that isn't derived from a worldview. As if there's a worldview neutral kind of policy. Is that what you're getting at? And so I think what he's asking is when Christians are accused of putting forward policies in line with their particular worldview of faith, why is it that that's problematic, but when an atheist puts forward a public policy in line with their worldview or lack of faith, why is that okay? Because Christians are often accused of putting forward public policies that are specifically Christian in the sense that that's aligned with your faith. For example, you take the abortion debate, not so we get into that debate, but take that, for example, and say, well, you're pushing your faith on the rest of the world, or the rest of the country, when you say that we shouldn't be allowed to kill unborn children. And that's just a faith perspective you have. Well, why is it that the other is seen, the position that comes out of worldview where we say, hey, we don't believe in God, and so therefore we reject the idea that these, not all atheists do, but we reject the idea that these unborn children are actually worthy of protecting, and that's somehow a neutral position in public policy.
Should we do the...
You can take whatever issue you want. I'm just giving that as an example.
The audience.
Let me add one more thing, though. I think, going back to the other question as well, is that, let's just say the Christian way of looking at things, or even Islam, etc. I think if you're trying to forbid your government from doing evil, right, you also should command them to do good. So the question about the widow and orphan, you should be, if you're willing to speak out against government, and they're trying to do things you think are immoral, political standards, or in my case, Quranic standards, then you should also stand up in other areas, right? Where you're saying they shouldn't be involved in. Okay, so I'm sure they will think they shouldn't necessarily be involved in dealing with poverty. Well, wait a minute, why are you willing to forbid them in one area and not command them in another area? Okay, so I think that if you're advising, right, you're looking at from the scriptural point of advising government, you should advise them on both. So I do think that's the role of the faith-based communities is to still advise their governments in all these areas, which of course includes the widow and the orphan. And then about the other question in regards to the worldview, I still think that as long as the majority of the people are faith-based, the majority of people are God-fearing, the majority of people understand the basics of morality and virtue. I don't know that we don't represent the majority when we talk about most of the issues that were found in the Bible and the Quran and things to that effect. Now, by the same token, I think it is somewhat oppressive if we were going to take a constitution like this constitution and the law like the law that we have and the separation that does exist and try to apply literally a lot of these concepts. I don't think we're really able to do that. So
Just let me make one little caveat. Conservatives don't believe that government should not be involved in building the poor. It's not a question of whether they ought to be involved, it's how the government ought to be involved, not whether. And so I want to be careful about those sorts of mischaracterizations.
Okay, somebody here had a question and they asked me to read it for them. It actually has, sorry. It has to do with the presidential campaign. The question is, how have the recent riots in the Middle East affected the presidential campaign? Do you believe the response to the man who made the anti-Islam video was appropriate? So we'll start with
What was the second part?
do you believe the response to the man who made the anti-Islam video appropriate?
You're talking about
The riots that occurred in the Via and the U.S. consuls and all that.
Okay, the response by who?
I think, I'm not sure.
The nation? President
President
Obama?
Yeah, well, how do you think it's going to affect the presidential campaign? And then as for the response, I'm not sure.
Oh, I don't think it's going any place as long as we don't see anything else. Right now, I don't see it as a big factor.
The first part of the question, can you read that again?
How have the recent riots in the Middle East affected the presidential campaign?
I'm not one to go and advocate for one candidate or the other, but one thing about Romney that I've seen is that he's got a lot of opinions on a lot of issues and multiple opinions on the same issues. So that's concerning. I gotta say, and again, I'm not, it's a bit odd for me. We really like people to speak an issue and be pretty much convinced on it. I think people can change their minds. He did explain why he changed his mind about abortion, and I understood his explanation, quite frankly, with all these other issues. I don't believe what politicizing a lot of matters that concern this nation's national security, or, for example, the event that took place in Benghazi, the politicizing of that event, literally right when it was going on, was just bad. I don't know who advised these people to do that, but by the same token, I don't understand what the administration has done in the way they've explained it either. I just don't get it. Both sides, I don't get what they're doing in that regard. What's the long-term or the effects that they're going to be on in terms of the election, et cetera? Unless the riots in the Middle East, turn into some world war or something, I don't think it's going to, I really don't think it's going to have much of an effect. I think what it tells, again, is the nature of politics. If the president's administration decided that they needed to answer in the way that they did because of politics, because of the election, that's sad. And if Mitt Romney decided to do what he did and attacking the administration at the time that he should have been supporting them and bring about the loss of life, Ambassador Stevens, by all accounts, seems like one of the most decent people. He seemed to have cared so much about Libya and about the people there. I don't think they gave his family a chance to mourn. They gave the people a chance to mourn. They immediately turned it into something as silly as politics. Politics is not a big deal. Human life is way better and more important. And so I was very saddened by his loss and the loss of the other Americans and the loss of the 10 Muslims that tried to defend them. And of course, then also the riots. I'm very disappointed in a lot of fellow Muslims for reacting in ways they should not be reacting. The Prophet Muhammad would absolutely not allow. Quran does not allow, and harming property and more importantly harming persons was very unfortunate. Those were the issues. That's how we need to deal with that issue. Politicizing it was very sad for the country.
Next question.
A few years ago, the Church of Latter-day Saints donated millions of dollars to help push Proposition 8 in California. Religious institutions all over the country actively make their viewpoints known and support certain policies. And I was going to say, the way I understand it is, one of the characteristics of a nonprofit organization is to stay removed from politics. What is the current justification for letting institutions that engage in these types of activities remain as a nonprofit organization, tax-exempt status?
Just a couple things to address that. For the current justification overall is freedom of religion and freedom of speech. But if you want to move beyond that with nonprofits, it depends on the type of nonprofit you are and whether or not you can engage in political activities. If you're a 501c3, i.e. a church, then you can only, according to the IRS standard, which I have a copy of, you can only engage in political activities up to 5% of your church's time and 5% of your church's money is the current standard set by the IRS. So 5% of the church's time and activities and money can be given to specifically political issues. Now, by political issues, we mean ideological issues like marriage, the marriage issue, something that is defined as a moral or religious issue. They cannot give it to parties or to candidates. So they can't put either of those two things, according to IRS current definition and the way they enforce it. Further, if you're a 501c4, you can engage in nonprofit activities of education and spend money, even with regard to political candidates and parties. You have to be a little bit more careful there. So I don't know what percentage of the Mormon Church's money was given to Proposition 8 efforts. I have no idea. My guess is that if the IRS considered it excessive, they'd go after it because the IRS likes to give their money, right? So that's my guess. They're pretty relentless about getting their money. So.
Yeah, and as you know, for us, the Muslim community, we tend to, let the Muslims, our people know that it's better to be vote the issues, support the issues, oppose the issues, depending on the issue, more so than the party or the candidate. It's really the issue. It's what their effect is on society. That's a big deal, and that's what we tend to look at more than anything. We advocate for that. So even in our role as a 501c, or in our role as just a religious advisor to our community, freely, we would tell them still just to look at the issue, etc. So the Mormon Church, it would seem like they're looking at the issue more than anything, and most faith-based communities actually supported that.
Next question.
I was wondering what each of you think would be a healthy level of involvement for the United States on a global scale. It seems like America can't do right whether they get involved or don't get involved. So what would you guys think would be proper way to respond?
Hey, Rod, just move the microphone. The question is specifically how much ought the United States to be involved. I'm not a foreign policy expert. I'm a pastor. I don't claim to be omnicompetent, so I don't know everything about every topic. And so I'm not exactly sure how much the United States ought to be involved or not involved in the world. I'm not a big fan of being the world's policeman. I was extremely disappointed that George W. Bush campaigned saying that he didn't believe in being the world's policeman and he didn't want to do nation building. And then when he took office, he started being the world's policeman and doing nation building. That disappointed me as a conservative. But to be honest with you, and to be fair to him, I wasn't in any of his intelligence briefings. I'm not a foreign policy expert, so I have no idea whether he was actually doing the right thing or not. From my perspective, I think we'd be better off if we left poor countries alone and took care of home. But that doesn't mean I don't think we ought to have a strong military. I do think we ought to peace through strength. Right, so I'm a fan of that, but that doesn't mean I think we ought to be just involving ourselves in every part of the world. And to take that further, I'm extremely concerned with Obama's drone striking policy right now, and the number of innocent civilians that are being killed. And they're saying it's a surgical strike to take out terrorists, and unfortunately, lots of people are being killed, families, children. Some homes now they have a double bomb policy where they'll bomb a home, wait for the safety personnel to get there, and then drone bomb it again when the safety personnel get there, just to make sure they do the job. And I can't imagine the man whose campaign in 2007, 2008, the things he said about Bush's policy, and having and closing Guantanamo Bay, which he didn't do. And then going and drone killing all these innocent people, and at the same time coming in and having a kill list in which he can take out Americans and no one's allowed to know about it. I mean, all of these issues concern me. Now again, I say that concerns me, and yet I don't know all the intelligence data that he has. I know he's missed about 60% of his intelligence briefings.
No, Chad.
That concerns me.
Chad, no. Bush did not like reading, that's why he had intelligence briefings. President Obama enjoys reading, he reads these things, and he doesn't need to be briefed.
Actually, that's factually correct. According to statistics,
he's not missing.
Bush actually read 2 books a week, apparently, which is pretty smart.
Well,
I'm not defending Bush. You can hear me.
I'm just saying you can't say that he's missing his briefings when he gets the information and he reads it.
60% of the
So, anyways, let me address your question here. I think the United States is an indispensable nation, and the reason why is, I teach international relations, American foreign policy. If you look at the history of the world, when you look at the history of the world, in particular the last 200 years, there's an ebb and flow. We see recurring patterns over time. And it's pretty simple. There are certain structures that you see in the international community. Every time you see a dominant set of players pull back from a stable structure, we have always ended up in major war, what we call hegemonic warfare. And I won't get into details. You can take my international relations class. But here's the point. I believe the United States has a role. And not only a role, but a responsibility to act in the international community. Now, whether the drone strikes and the rest of that stuff, that's debatable. But the point is, until the human condition improves, it is incumbent upon, especially now, the United Nations to lead in areas like this. I'm not necessarily saying that we should be the nation's 911, the global community's 911, but there's absolutely no doubt that the United States has a role globally, and not just a role, but a responsibility. And literally, I spend 2 hours a night, Tuesday and Thursday, talking about this stuff, so I'm just going to leave it at that.
You know,
Another question?
can I just,
The last one?
I want to get a little on this. Yeah, you know, internationally, as a world power, affecting
Joker? Yeah, last one.
issues. You know, we did the world a great favor when we defeated the Soviet Union with the help of Mujahideen warriors out of Afghanistan. For whatever reason, we turned around and we're at war with the very people that helped us defeat the Soviet Union. Okay. We helped Iraq in a war against Iran, and then helped Iran when the war was starting to teeter one way or the other. We kind of chose who we were going to help depending on the way that war was going. But we were openly in support of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and we even gave him weapons of mass destruction, from the chemical weapons. Rumsfeld was there on the ground, shaking his hand and helping him out, set up these things. We have chosen to help whenever we felt it served us, and hurt whenever we felt it served us, it seems, in some of these areas. And it really is creating a lot of distrust on the ground in a lot of these places. Do we have a place in the world? Of course we do. We're still the world power. But what type of place is it, and how should it be dictated? And should we, when we look back right now, we can't change a lot of what happened, let's say from the 80s on, because really that Iran-Iraq war gave us a black eye. The situation in Afghanistan right now, I'll tell you right here today that I was adamantly opposed to us invading Afghanistan. 100% opposed to it. That was a surgical situation. We're in the longest war right now we've been in decades, and we're not winning. And it is demoralizing our troops, and it's causing a lot of problems, and it's costing us a lot of money. And we're not sure how to get out. And I think, Chad made a great point that he doesn't have intelligence briefings and all that. Well, Obama said we're going to get out of Iraq and out of Afghanistan, we're going to shut down Guantanamo and all that. Well, then he gets in there and he realizes what the other administration really got us into. And it isn't easy to get out of, okay? So I don't believe war is ever a decision you make lightly. I believe, and I also believe that those military people who served in war and they became the commanders, I believe a lot of them really don't want us to go into war unless it is absolutely necessary and they know that they can win. So I really think that we have a problem when we do all these things. We really need to be cautious about it. We need to be able to be honest with our people. Our people need to be very firm with the politicians that are going to try to take us into these places in the world. And I don't know, honestly, if I could say this to all of us, the real blame will come back on the majority of Americans whenever our government does these things and they're unjust. And I'm going to tell you right now, we have done unjust things in the world. And we've done a lot of good in the world too. But we've done unjust things in the world. So let's just take Obama, for example. Not a war-type person, you wouldn't think, but we are in a war. He stayed in 2 wars. He's gotten us out of Iraq on time, according to what the Bush administration had already set place. We have more drone attacks than Bush ever maybe dreamed of it. I don't know. I don't know. You know, but we're in a, you know, I think Obama might be in his own nightmare trying to figure out how to get out of all of this. And we're not helping the overall world situation when it comes to reduction in terrorism. You know, we as Muslims, again, we look at this situation with another vantage point. And we look at our policies and we look at the things that are said and done, and especially the actions of our military covert, you know, operations. And we think, guys, you're not helping us because we're trying to defeat extremism. We're trying to defeat, you know, radical Islam. We're Orthodox Islam. We're mainstream Orthodox Islam. We're trying to defeat it. And you're making our jobs really hard. I don't mind the hate groups that are here. They got to do what they got to do for their own reasons. Okay? They want to call us all these things. They want to, you know, agitate those people overseas. Like the video, it's something that's just trying to agitate and make people do bad things. And less than 1% of the Muslims, you know, got involved in some things. But we're saying we see a problem with our policies. So we really need to look at America as a voice and an example. But I don't know that we need to be forcing anybody to do anything.
By the way, let me put one qualification on there for Iman, because I think some of my evangelical Christian brothers and sisters may not be aware. He's sitting here not as a man who you might suspect is against the state of Israel and wants that to be crushed and thrown out. That isn't the position that he takes. I'm correct on that, right?
Well, okay, I'll qualify that.
Okay, well, you qualified that. I'm not going to qualify.
Yeah. I know the state of Israel being crushed. No, obviously, I didn't say that. But me and him talked privately, and I said, my belief is that Israel has won this war, whether it's with the help of America or wherever else it may be. This is something that we need to accept. We need to stop lying to the Palestinian refugees. The Arab countries need to stop lying to them about who won this war. Israel should go ahead and take west of the Jordan and give those Palestinian refugees, those Arab refugees, the right of citizenship, the right of of their owning their land, living a free life, living as Israeli citizens, or freely giving them a fair and just compensation. That's something that's in a private discussion that we had, meaning this is the reality of the situation. It's like when we go back in history, we look at the Crusades, and the Crusaders took Jerusalem. It was the Christians that took it from the Muslims, okay? For 100 years, the Muslims didn't go ask the United Nations or the EU or the US or anybody else or prick and prod at the Crusaders saying, give us our country back, give us our land back. They went and they became a better, stronger, more God-fearing society and came back and fought and took the land and with every bit of rules of warfare and engagement that Islam imposes on them. Okay, so there's no suicide bombings, no killing of innocent civilians, and while your enemy either opposes you or doesn't oppose you, you don't do those things. So for us, I don't believe right now the policies, the lies that are going on in the Middle East and in regards to the state of Israel, from our vantage point, the Muslim and Arab vantage point, is good for us. It's not good for Islam. It's created a war against Islam, a war against the Muslims, and a war against the Arabs of Palestine, and the refugees outside of Palestine and within Gaza and the West Bank have lost generations of children in this harsh and brutal occupation. And it's not just, I'm not just talking about the Arab nations, the Muslim nations, but also Israel has a responsibility to be fair about this matter. Step up and say, look, we have a responsibility. We've taken over this land. We have a responsibility to indigenous people that already live here and own property here and have families here. They do have a responsibility. For some reason, we don't think that. So that's more of a qualification.
Can I just ask one follow-up question of you, Ahmad, on that?
It's okay with the moderator.
Is that okay?
We're past 7, but
okay, the audience can leave, I suppose.
Have the last word. I don't know.
Just real quick one. Do you think so is what you're saying that while Israel has won this war and is in the land that they're in, and as long as they ought to treat the Palestinians fairly, and that ought to be the state of Israel until, using your Crusades example, until which time the Muslims build a large enough army to reconquer it? Is that what you're saying?
Well, like we're talking about end-time prophecy. We believe, like you and I talked about end-time prophecy, where we said that you believe Jesus is going to lead the believers. We believe that end-time prophecy, when Jesus comes back to the earth, he's going to lead the believers, and he's going to obviously take over the world, not only the state of Israel. He will be the head of that movement. Jesus Christ is upon him. So, no, we're not talking about today. We're not talking about what we should be doing. But yes, eventually, the Muslims. The point in this is this: in our rules of engagement, okay, rules of warfare, the United States government knows about and has written about and has detailed about it in the Department of Defense and the Strategic Institute, the Strategies Institute. We cannot kill women, children, monks, animals. We can't cut down vegetation. We can't destroy buildings. We have no right to do any of these. We can't commit suicide in warfare. No harm can come to any innocents, okay? So my point in this is that there's no justification, regardless of how oppressed you may feel you are in Islamic law, to commit any of these types of crimes against yourself or against humanity. Now, if the Muslims get strong enough in a just jihad, according to the ways of the Prophet and according to the rules of engagement I just laid out, and in much more detail than that, turn around and fight Israel in a fair fight, sure, and they take over the land, well, they better be good to those Israelis that are captured, and they better give them citizenship, and they better make sure that they treat them fairly and honestly and not harm them.
Start a world war.
Mark, that's the last word.
Well, I could probably extend this another 5, 10, 15 minutes. I think I'll just leave it at this. Before the creation of Israel, Harry Truman was asked a number of questions, and he just finally threw up his hands and said, if Jesus Christ couldn't fix peace here on earth in that region when he was here on earth, what the hell would they want? So I'm just going to leave it at that.
If you want more information about the events and activities of the